The unspoken words. The mahogany door was ajar. The 28th floor hallway, usually silent at this hour, seemed to hold its breath with her. Audrey's hands trembled as she clutched the insulated bag. She had chosen Julian's favorite meal, steak tartare from the tiny French bistro he frequented in his youth. 5 years of marriage. Nothing grand, just an intimate celebration for two life partners, or at least that's what she believed. The muffled sound of a woman's laughter made her stop. She knew that laugh, high-pitched, a little vain, a little practiced. Chloe Vance, the communications intern, with eyes that always lingered too long on Julian's suits. A chill ran down her spine. Still, she took 2 more steps and with her fingertips, pushed the door open another inch. The crack revealed more than any shout ever could. Chloe stood in front of him. Julian's hands, which had so often held Audrey's in moments of fear, were now on the other woman's waist. His smile was the same, gentle, charming, yet in this context, it looked like a cruel mask. The sound of a muffled kiss resonated like a slap across her heart. Audrey didn't cry. She stood there for an eternal instant, feeling the floor give way beneath her feet. Her vision blurred, not from tears, but from disbelief, as if it were a scene she wasn't a part of, a cheap soap opera mistakenly using the faces of those she loved. With a deliberate movement, she closed the door with a firm click. The silence that followed was almost religious. Julian saw her. His body froze. Chloe pulled away, confused, adjusting her blouse. Audrey didn't scream. She simply walked to the glass table, placed the insulated bag on the floor, and with a voice low but sharp as a knife, she said, "I saw you." The phrase hung in the air like an unsung lament. There was no scandal, no crying. There was a tone of finality, of an absolute goodbye. Julian got up, his mouth agape, searching for words he didn't even know where to begin. But Audrey had already turned her back. The sound of the door closing behind her was louder than any argument could ever be. In the hallway, the world seemed strange, out of place. She walked mechanically to the elevator. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the button, but her face remained serene, not from peace, but from paralysis. Alone in the elevator, Audrey finally allowed a single tear to slide down her cheek. Just one, enough to confirm that it had been real, that there was a life before this moment, and now, another after. On the street, the city was still alive. Car horns, laughter, lights. But for her, everything seemed distant. The night had swallowed everything. Julian remained motionless, as if time had collapsed. The boardroom, once so familiar, now felt like a stage for a Greek tragedy, where the mirrored walls reflected not the power of a magnate, but the devastated image of a defeated man. Chloe, ashamed and uneasy, gathered her things in a hurry and left without a word. The door closed behind her with a timid, insignificant click compared to the emotional thunder that had just occurred. The anniversary dinner lay on the floor. The scent of her homemade French food filled the room with cruel irony. Julian approached slowly, as if treading on rubble. He opened the bag. The steak tartare was perfectly packed, accompanied by a carefully folded napkin. Inside, a small card with Audrey's handwriting read, "To another 5 years, and all the ones to follow." The words hit him harder than any accusation. He sat at the table, looking at the food as if it were an offering from another time, another life. He tried to imagine what she had felt, seeing him with another woman. Not just the physical betrayal, but the destruction of an entire history they had so carefully built. For an instant, he buried his head in his hands. The regret was as physical as it was psychological. A lump in his throat, a knot in his stomach, his breathing ragged. Julian had always believed he could control everything. Business, image, even feelings. He never truly believed Audrey would leave. She had always loved him too much, or so he thought. That night, he didn't go home. He stayed right there. The office, sitting in the darkness. His phone buzzed. Then it vibrated nonstop. Messages from Chloe, from his assistant, from friends inviting him to a party. But there was no sound more deafening than the silence Audrey had left behind. At dawn, Julian went home. Every corner of the apartment seemed inhabited by her. The books on the shelf, the shoes lined up in the closet, the soft scent of her perfume on the pillow. But the most devastating thing was the emptiness. Her suitcases were gone. Not a single item of clothing, no farewell note. Just absence. And the silence. He called dozens of times, sent messages, emails, even digital letters. He tried to find her in all their usual spots, their favorite cafe, the bookstore where she spent hours. Nothing. It was as if Audrey had evaporated from the world, leaving behind only the traces of pain. The realization came in stages, like a slow demolition. First, the loss. Then, the guilt. And finally, the recognition of something he had avoided for years. He was the problem. Not just for the betrayal, but for all the previous moments when he had stayed silent, distanced himself, and built walls around himself, leaving Audrey to knock from the outside until she grew tired. And then, the question he couldn't ignore, the one that burned in his mind like a live coal. How did he let things get to a point of no return? The man behind the mask, before he was Julian Foster, the magnate on magazine covers and in business headlines, he was just Julian, a quiet kid from a small town in the Midwest, the middle child of a couple obsessed with perfection. His father, a rigid and methodical engineer, expected excellence in everything. His mother, an elegant socialite, lived for appearances. From a young age, Julian understood that love in his home came with conditions, impeccable grades, unwavering posture, contained emotions. In adolescence, he discovered that vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford. The few times he tried to express sadness or fear were met with phrases like, "Men don't cry," or "You have to be strong." So he learned to silence what he felt and to wear the armor of perfection. He was the model student, the responsible brother, the young prodigy who, at 17, already knew he would study business and build something great. During college at Northwestern University, Julian was both admired and fired. Intelligent, articulate, always one step ahead. His charisma was studied, almost calculated. He knew exactly what to say, how to behave, what to wear. The insecure boy from the Midwest was hidden behind well-cut suits and practiced smiles. At 28, he founded his first boutique hotel chain in the Caribbean. In 3 years, he owned a network that stretched across the region. An empire built with surgical precision. The press called him the architect of tropical luxury. He said he had no time for distractions, read, feelings. The truth was, the more he grew professionally, the more he distanced himself from any real connection. He learned to measure people's value by their efficiency. He only trusted those who delivered results. In the few relationships he had, everything was superficial. Glamorous parties, expensive gifts, empty promises. No woman managed to break through the wall he had built himself. Until Audrey. When he met her, she was the opposite of everything he knew. Spontaneous, sensitive, emotionally open. At first, it irritated him. But there was something magnetic about the way she saw the world, as if everything could still be beautiful, even after it was broken. She wanted nothing from him but time and truth, and that, paradoxically, was what terrified him most. By marrying Audrey, Julian believed he could be the man she saw in him. But he didn't know how. He was so used to living for the outside, to maintaining an impeccable facade, that he hadn't learned to be truly present, always busy, always traveling, always worried about the next expansion. In the rare moments at home, he offered gifts instead of presents, and she patiently waited. What few knew or preferred not to see was that Julian lived in fear. Fear of being discovered as insufficient. Imposter syndrome gnawed at him, not because of his business, but because of his feelings. He didn't believe himself worthy of true love, and because of that, when Chloe appeared with her blind adoration and obvious desire, he gave in, not out of passion, but out of weakness. Because with her, he didn't need to be real, just admired. Behind every impeccable decision and every achievement plastered on the pages of Forbes, there was a man exhausted from pretending, alone in his luxury penthouse, amidst imported wines and modern art. Julian Foster was just a boy from the Midwest, still waiting for a hug that never came. And now, with Audrey gone, he would have to face for the first time what he had avoided for so long. Who was he, really, without the masks, the silent gaps? For a long time, Julian and Audrey's life ran like a Swiss watch, precise, elegant, but impersonal. They would wake up together, share the same breakfast, exchange quick kisses before leaving for their commitments. To any observer, they were a perfect couple. But behind the choreographed routine was a growing silence, like an echo that refused to die. There were things Audrey wanted to say but didn't. How much she missed talking without looking at the clock, dancing barefoot in the kitchen without being called distracted, feeling she was still seen as a woman, not a static piece of a social portrait. But every time she tried to open up, Julian would deflect. He would say he was tired, that it wasn't the right time, that she was being too dramatic. Julian, for his part, also had words stuck in his throat. He was afraid to admit that he didn't know how to be vulnerable, that he didn't trust anyone enough to be emotionally naked. He avoided saying that success left him exhausted, that sometimes he felt everything he had built was an elegant lie. Instead of confessing, he stayed silent. Silence was his way of protecting himself and, without realizing it, of hurting her. The chasm between them didn't arise with the betrayal. It was dug little by little, by nights they slept side by side without touching, by dinners where their eyes didn't meet, by smiles that served protocol more than affection. Love didn't end. It simply drowned in the absence of dialogue, in the sterile repetition of days that always seemed the same. Audrey sometimes wrote short notes left on his pillow or on the breakfast table. "I miss you. I dreamed of you last night. I want to talk." Julian read them, but rarely responded. He believed that gestures didn't require words, that his physical presence was enough. He didn't understand that love doesn't live only on physical presence, but on listening, on exchange, on active care. They had plans, but they never revisited them together. They talked about having children someday, about trips when there was time, about projects later, always later. And in that later, intimacy slowly died. They became calendar partners, commitment accomplices, but strangers in their own home. On certain nights, Audrey would find herself imagining what would have happened if she had insisted more, if she had screamed, cried, demanded. But that wasn't her way. She loved with silence and presence and hoped it would be enough. When she realized it wasn't, it was already too late. The silence had become an impassable wall. Julian, meanwhile, believed that stability was enough. He grew up believing that love was demonstrated with responsibility, with paid bills, with silent loyalty. He never learned that loving also means being emotionally vulnerable, risking being fragile in front of the other person. And for fear of appearing weak, he chose silence, as if it could protect him from everything. But what he didn't say, "I'm sorry, I'm lost, I need you," was exactly what destroyed everything. And now, each in their own corner, they had to face the cruelest of lessons. Sometimes silence weighs more than any mistake. The Unsent Letters, please share this story, leave your thoughts, and subscribe for more content. Chloe Vance appeared like so many other young, promising faces who passed through Julian's company. Full of energy, with ambition in her eyes, and a smile that seemed to know more than it said. She was 24 and had a notable talent for digital marketing, but what really set her apart was her audacity. Unlike the other interns, she wasn't intimidated by Julian's imposing figure. On the contrary, she provoked him with sharp questions, veiled compliments, and an almost theatrical confidence. At first, Julian saw her only as another efficient collaborator. He noticed her sparkle, her striking presence, but dismissed any deeper interpretation. For him, Chloe's insinuations were harmless, part of a power game in which he was always in control. When she started calling him her favorite boss, or commenting on how good navy blue looked on him, he would just smile, but he never reprimanded her. He believed it meant nothing, and deep down, maybe he wanted to believe it. Audrey noticed Chloe at the first corporate event they were all at together. The way she approached Julian, how she lightly touched his arm when she laughed, how her eyes lingered a little too long on his lips. It was subtle, but clear, and once again, Audrey chose to trust. She preferred to believe that Julian would never cross that line, that the bond between them was stronger than any youthful flirting. Still, small cracks began to appear, messages answered too late, meetings that ran longer than expected, Julian's gaze more absent than usual. Audrey would ask cautiously, "Everything okay?" And he, always cordial, would say it was just fatigue, that work was heavy, that nothing had changed. And in a way it was true, except for what he refused to admit, even to himself. Chloe, on the other hand, was persistent. She knew Julian wore armor and was determined to find the weak points. Little by little, she got closer, asking for personal advice, praising his leadership in an almost intimate way, creating situations where they needed to work late, alone. She played intelligently, testing the limits, just waiting for the moment he would let his guard down. And he did. Not all at once. It was gradual, almost imperceptible. One too many shared laughs, a compliment accepted without resistance, a touch not rejected. He told himself it wasn't betrayal, that everything was under control. But the truth was, there was a part of him that felt seen by Chloe in a way he hadn't felt with Audrey in a long time, not because of her fault, but because of his own inability to show himself. Audrey, as intuitive as ever, felt the changes in the air. She had no proof, no smoking gun. She only had the intuition of a woman who loved someone deeply. But instead of confronting him, she faltered. And for love, for fear of losing, for blind hope, she ignored the signs. She continued making homemade dinners, writing sweet notes, trying to rekindle a flame she wasn't even sure still existed. The betrayal didn't begin the moment Julian kissed Chloe. It began much earlier, in the glances he didn't divert, in the words he didn't say, in the cowardly silences. And Audrey, still unknowingly, had already begun to say goodbye. Not to the marriage, but to the idea that love alone would be enough to sustain them both. Deep down, Everyone knew. Julian knew it. Audrey felt it. Chloe played the game. And no one, absolutely no one, wanted to face the truth before it was too late. The weight of absence. Audrey's departure wasn't loud. She left no letters or notes. There were no bags thrown or dramatic farewells. She simply vanished. When Julian got home the next night, he found the apartment in a strange order. Nothing was scattered, nothing was broken, but with an absence that hurt like an open wound exposed to the wind. Her closet was empty. The photos of the couple, always scattered delicately around the living room, were gone. The plants she lovingly cared for now stood silent as witnesses to the abandonment. Julian panicked. He searched his contacts, called her closest friends, visited the cafes and bookstores she frequented. But it was as if Audrey had evaporated from the world. Even her social media accounts were deactivated. He went to her parents' apartment, only to be met with a closed door and a terse message from her mother. She asked that you not look for her. What destroyed him most wasn't anger. It was the silence. Audrey, who had always believed in words, who wrote letters and notes, even when there were no fights, now communicated only with absence. This made Julian feel not just like a traitor, but also invisible, as if there was no longer a place for him in her life. In the following days, he tried everything. He sent flowers to her old colleagues, hired a private detective, accessed old emails looking for clues. Nothing. Every attempt was a cruel reminder that she didn't want to be found. He revisited all the messages he had ignored, all the glances he had diverted, all the "we'll talk laters" that never happened. Now, everything screamed in his memory as warnings he had never wanted to hear. The nights became a torment. Julian spent hours staring at the ceiling, mentally rewriting the conversations that never happened. He started drinking frequently, something he had once considered a waste of time. He stopped going to the company. His face, always present at meetings and events, was now replaced by formal press releases. Partners worried, but he barely heard them. By the third week, in a desperate gesture, he went to the beach where they had spent their honeymoon. He stayed for 3 days in the same hotel, waiting, not knowing exactly for what. Maybe a message, a sign, a miracle. He would sit in the same restaurant where she used to order grilled fish and lemonade, looking out at the sea with an emptiness in his chest that even the warm wind couldn't fill. There, for the first time, he cried for real. Not tears of anger, not tears of wounded pride, but a silent, pained, deep weeping. The crying of a man who finally understood that he had lost something that couldn't be bought, replaced, or easily won back. The crying of someone who realizes that love requires presence, not just promises. He returned to Chicago like a ghost. The apartment seemed bigger, colder, more silent. He started seeing Audrey everywhere, in the shadows of the hallway, in the clothes forgotten in a drawer, in the scent that still lingered on his pillow. The world kept spinning, but Julian had stopped. And then came the final silence, the confirmation that Audrey had stopped trying to reach him, and now it was he who was shouting for her into the void. But she was no longer listening. The new beginning. It was on a morning of persistent nausea that Audrey decided to take the test. She was staying in a small hotel in Albany, away from her family, her friends, and any trace that could lead Julian to her. For days, her body had felt strange. The fatigue, the morning sickness, a sudden sensitivity to fragrances, a new aversion to the coffee she had always loved. Still, the confirmation came like a sudden punch to the stomach. Pregnant, and not with one, but with two. Twins, sitting on the cold bathroom floor, holding the positive test in her trembling hands. Audrey felt the world spin. She didn't cry. Not yet. There was just a crushing silence inside her. Part of her wanted to run, to hide, to pretend it wasn't true. Another part, more raw and wounded, whispered that this was the perfect opportunity for revenge. To tell Julian, to make him suffer, to force him to face the consequences of what he destroyed. But the clearest voice of all was the one that cried out for protection, not for herself, for her children, for those two Liaozes growing inside her. Getting revenge through the pregnancy would put her in a game that had already destroyed too much. She didn't want her children used as instruments of pain. She wanted them to come into the world without the weight of the past, free from the shadow of betrayal. During sleepless nights, Audrey talked in silence to the babies who didn't yet have names. She touched her belly and promised to do the impossible to make them feel loved. She decided, with the firmness of someone who has lost everything and still chooses to love, that she would raise these children alone. It would be difficult. It would be painful. But it would be dignified. And above all, it would be true. She returned to a charming coastal town in Maine, where she had spent a summer years before, still single, when she was writing her second award-winning story. It was a quiet, artistic, colorful place where time seemed to move differently. She rented a simple cottage with large windows and white walls. Far from luxury, she found space to breathe. The first weeks were about adaptation. She learned to cook for herself, to walk slowly, to deal with the nausea. She bought books on motherhood and wrote a lot, not for publication, but to understand herself. She started a diary where she recorded everything, her fears, her dreams, her promises. Each word was a way of sewing the broken pieces back together. The ultrasound that confirmed the baby's gender, 2 boys, was one of the most quietly intense moments of her life. There was no applause, no hands to hold, no Julian to hold her shoulders. But there was a different kind of peace, a certainty that even alone, she was enough, that these children would be loved with every fiber of her soul. In time, her belly grew, and with it, a new Audrey. More introspective, more selective, stronger. The woman who had once been a shadow in a powerful man's life now became her own light. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared. It still came in waves, mostly at night. But it no longer defined her days. Audrey knew that one day Julian would have the right to know. But not now. Not while she is still in the process of rebuilding. First, she needed to remake herself. Then, she would decide if he had a place or a right to be a part of this new chapter. For now, it was just her and the boys. 3 hearts beating in a single body. 3 stories being born from an ending. The tears that didn't fall. Please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this video. The town in Maine welcomed her like a silent embrace. The cobblestone streets, the colorful houses with weathered wooden doors, the cafes smelling of fresh bread, and the warm breeze that carried the sound of bells and distant music created an atmosphere of reunion, not with other people, but with herself. Audrey arrived with few suitcases and a belly that was already starting to give away her secret. Here, no one knew her, and that was liberating. She rented a simple house with large windows that let the morning light flood the rooms. The kitchen was small but charming. The room was upstairs, with a view of the mountains. The neighborhood was quiet, made up of artists, retired gentlemen, and single mothers who looked at her with silent sympathy. For the first time in a long time, Audrey felt she didn't need to fake strength. She just needed to exist. The first weeks were slow. Her days were divided between light walks at dawn, trips to the local market, long readings in the shade of the trees in the town square, and, above all, silence. Not the silence of abandonment she had known with Julian, but a fertile silence, like a field preparing to bloom. It was the kind of quiet that allowed her to listen to herself again. It was on a rainy afternoon that writing returned, without warning, without planning. Audrey was sitting at the living room table, watching the water run down the window, when she felt a strange urgency in her hands. She picked up her notebook and began to write. It wasn't a story or a novel. It was a letter to herself, an intimate confession, a rescue. After that, she didn't stop. Over the next few months, she wrote every day. Sometimes very early, other times in the middle of the night when the babies seemed to be dancing inside her. Her words didn't come out as they used to, controlled, clean, politically correct. Now they came out raw, sometimes disorganized, sometimes fierce, but always true. She was writing her pain, yes, but also her reconstruction. Soon, the notebooks began to pile up. Audrey started typing them up on the old laptop she had brought. She thought maybe there was a book in there, not a book about motherhood or betrayal or romance, but about bravery, about continuing even when everything inside you wants to stop, about choosing yourself. And little by little, the project took shape. The town welcomed her with small gestures. The newspaper stand owner who always greeted her with a smile and saved literary copies for her. The bookstore owner who, upon learning Audrey was a writer, invited her to join a book club. The elderly neighbor who brought her cornbread one afternoon and stayed for hours talking about children and loss. This town, with its own rhythm, offered her a cure without hurry, without demands. As her belly grew, Audrey also grew, in strength, in clarity, in identity. She learned to assemble simple furniture, to care for the front garden, to prepare baby food even before the babies were born. And, more than anything, she learned to be alone without feeling lonely. There was sadness, yes, but it was no longer dominant. There was longing, but also hope. Her prenatal checkups became sacred moments. Seeing the forming faces, hearing two hearts beating inside her. It reminded her every day that she was creating lives, not just surviving. She started dreaming of names, of bedtime stories, of the first day of school. And in time, fear gave way to determination. These children would have everything she could give them. When she was 7 months along, she sat on the porch at sunset, a cup of tea in her hands, and the more than 100-page manuscript by her side. She watched the orange sky and smiled almost without realizing it. There, in that precise moment, she wasn't the betrayed woman, or the abandoned wife, or the forgotten writer. She was just Audrey, a mother, an author, a whole woman. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The silent return. The book was born before the children, almost like an emotional birth. Audrey finished the manuscript on a silent night, when a slight pain in her back announced that the end of gestation was approaching. She titled it, "The Tears That Didn't Fall," a tribute to the swallowed pain, the stifled screams, the nights when everything hurt inside. Her face remained serene. It was a raw book, unvarnished, a mirror of the soul. And for the first time, she didn't write to be accepted. She wrote to survive. The birth of the twins happened on a Sunday morning, under a sky filled with gray clouds and a cool breeze that entered the hospital in Maine like a blessing. Ethan came first, calm, almost solemn. Noah arrived shortly after, crying loudly, as if he already knew that life would be made of struggles. Both so different, yet united from the beginning. Audrey received them with tear-filled eyes, but not a single tear fell. She had learned to hold back the waters, and now she chose which ones to let flow. The first days were of total surrender, breastfeeding, changing, rocking, and repeating. Sleepless nights became routine, and Audrey's body no longer belonged to her. It was an instrument, a refuge, a comfort. But even in exhaustion, she felt a silent strength she never imagined she possessed. Every small gesture, the baby's sigh, an involuntary smile, the first gaze, was a spark of hope. She wrote when she could, sometimes between feedings, with the laptop on her lap and a child on her chest. Other times, she recorded voice notes for herself while walking with the stroller through the town center. The words returned, even in the midst of chaos. It was as if her identity insisted on not dying, even now, divided between diapers and postponed dreams. In time, Audrey decided to send the manuscript to a small, local publisher, almost without expectations. It was a friend from the book club who insisted, saying the world needed that story. 3 months later, she received the response. The book would be published. Not only that, it would be the publisher's literary bet of the year. The honesty of the text had deeply moved the editors, and with it also came an invitation for an interview in a national magazine. Her name was circulating again, now with a new story, a real, strong, unveiled story. Meanwhile, Ethan and Noah grew up healthy. Noah was restless, curious, and laughed easily. Ethan was more introspective, observant, but attached to details with a gentle sweetness. Audrey saw small traces of Julian in both of them, and sometimes that hurt. But it no longer pained her as it used to. It was a transformed pain, something she could now look at without anger, only with respect for what had happened. The book was launched in a small bookstore downtown, with a line for autographs and emotional readers. Some cried as they told her they had lived through similar betrayals. Others said they had found the courage to start over. Audrey signed each one, smiling with humility, as if she still didn't believe that the woman in front of the cameras was herself. That night, back at home, with the twins asleep and the newly launched book on her nightstand, Audrey allowed herself a moment of contemplation. She lit a candle, made a cup of tea, and looked at the ceiling. She wasn't thinking about Julian or the past. She was thinking about the present, about her children, about the silent peace of the house, about the sound of her own heart beating slowly. For the first time in years, she missed nothing. The tears that didn't fall no longer mattered, because in the end, it was that self-control that made her right. That made her reborn. That prepared her to be not only a mother or a writer, but someone who survived the storm and returned with a story to tell. And that story, now, was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been shattered and chose to rebuild themselves with dignity. The ruin of a life. While Audrey was being reborn in silence, Julian was falling apart in noise. In the months following her departure, his life transformed into a succession of erratic decisions, impulsive reactions, and a gradual descent into chaos. The first loss came as a direct consequence of his emotional absence. His leadership in the company began to be questioned. Partners, once loyal, started acting on their own. Canceled meetings, votes of no confidence, ignored documents. In less than a year, Julian had lost control of the empire he built with his own hands. He tried to pretend that nothing had changed. He appeared at social events with different women, always smiling, always with a drink in his hand. But his gaze no longer sustained the character. Gala dinners became empty, conversations repetitive, alcoholic toasts more and more frequent. Alcohol, which had previously appeared only as a social prop, became a constant refuge. It started with discreet drinks in the office, then became bottles hidden in his car, at home, in hotels where he stayed alone. Friends, noticing the deterioration, tried to intervene. Some offered help, others disappeared. The oldest, who had known him since youth, pulled away with sadness. He had repelled them all without realizing it, with his constant denial and inability to ask for help. He didn't want advice, much less pity, and deep down, he may have believed he deserved every loss he accumulated. He started living in luxury hotels, changing rooms frequently, as if fleeing from himself. The penthouse he lived in with Audrey was put up for sale in a moment of anger and nostalgia, and he never went back. He threw away the paintings she had chosen, the books she had given him, even the blanket they used to watch movies on the sofa. He believed that by getting rid of the objects, he would get rid of the guilt. But it was the opposite. Each burned item left an even bigger hole. Mornings became the worst time of day. The hangover hurt more in his soul than in his body. The dark room, the tangled sheets, the smell of alcohol and cheap perfume. Everything was a reminder that he had become a shadow of the man he once pretended to be. Julian, the magnate, was now just Julian, and he didn't know what to do with that. He started avoiding mirrors. The image he saw reflected was grotesque. Red eyes, unkempt beard, disheveled clothes. Not even the most expensive suit could hide the emptiness. New secretaries feared him. Old executives avoided him. His figure, once a symbol of control, had become synonymous with silent ruin. The press, for its part, was unforgiving. Reports on his meteoric fall appeared in the business columns. Malicious comments on social media said he had gone crazy after a heartbreak. Julian read it all. And although he refused to admit it, those headlines hurt more than any professional criticism. Because it wasn't about numbers. It was about human failure. One particularly difficult night, he woke up to the sound of a glass breaking. He didn't know if he had knocked it over or thrown it against the wall. Stumbling, he fell to the floor, tasting the metallic flavor of blood in his mouth and the saltiness of tears that finally began to fall. For the first time, he cried without reservations, not for what he had lost, but for what he had become. It was there, lying among shards and silence, that he finally understood. It wasn't Audrey who had abandoned him. He had abandoned himself much earlier, and now, with his life in ruins, the question persisted like a torturous mantra. Who is the man who remains when everything is taken away? The power, the prestige, the applause, the book of truth. It was just another morning, one of those Julian went through on autopilot. He had spent another night sleeping poorly, his eyes burning from a hangover, and his heart numbed by so many absences. The airport was a constant limbo in his life over the past few months. Boarding with no purpose, destinations with no real desire to arrive. This time, he was heading to Miami for a meeting with investors who had already decided to exclude him, but who still feigned cordiality. While waiting to board, Julian entered a bookstore, perhaps looking for a random magazine, anything to distract his eyes and silence his thoughts. He ran his fingers haphazardly over the spines until he stopped, frozen, in front of a book with a simple cover, but a title that seemed to shout, "The Tears That Didn't Fall." The author's name printed below, A. Miller, was like a dry blow to the stomach. A chill ran down his spine. He picked up the copy with trembling hands and flipped through it as if it were a sacred relic. In the dedication, for all who learned that silence can also scream, he knew. It was her, Audrey. And whatever was between those pages wasn't just literature. It was her heart. He bought the book without hesitation, and boarded like a man possessed. During the flight, he couldn't take his eyes off the words. The narrative was raw, emotional, honest. It was like spying on a diary that shouldn't be read, but still begged to be understood. Audrey spoke of a woman in love with an emotionally absent man, of the loneliness of loving in silence, of the trauma of betrayal, of the strength that is born when everything crumbles. Page after page, Julian recognized himself, not just as a character, but as the antagonist. He realized with horror that the real villain of the story wasn't the physical betrayal, but the emotional neglect, the subtle selfishness, the pride camouflaged as rationality. He hadn't just been the man who betrayed. He had been the man who abandoned her long before he left, who ignored signs, who silenced truths, who never had the courage to be whole. The fragment that tore him apart the most was the one where Audrey described the moment she realized that her love for him was no longer hope, but resistance. I still loved him, but loving someone who doesn't see you, who doesn't hear you, who is afraid of his own soul, is like loving a statue. Cold, beautiful, but unable to hug you. Julian closed the book with tears silently streaming down his face. For the first time, he didn't feel betrayed for having been exposed. He felt naked before his own truth. Upon landing, he felt like a different person, not in the sense of someone renewed, but as someone who finally sees the disaster after the storm. He couldn't go to the meeting. He took the first flight back to Chicago, locked himself in a cheap hotel room, and reread the book, this time taking notes on fragments, underlining words, as if studying a map to find his way back to himself. The next morning, he stared at the ceiling for hours. He thought about how she had written everything without hatred, with a devastating compassion. She didn't humiliate him. She only exposed him, showing both of them as they really were. Flawed, human, hurt. But she showed something even more disturbing, that she had moved on without him. And that crushed him more than any revenge. At the foot of the bed, with the closed book on his chest, Julian understood something he had never had the courage to face. The pain we cause others often comes from the cowardice of not facing our own pain. And now, if he wanted any forgiveness, or even to deserve to see the children he didn't know he had, he would have to do something he had never done in his life, rebuild himself from the inside out. The man who came back the next day, Julian woke up differently. For the first time in years, he had a goal that wasn't tied to profits, image, or control. It was visceral, almost primitive. He needed to see Audrey, not to beg for forgiveness, although he knew he would, but to face head-on what he had destroyed. After weeks of discreet investigation, he knew where she lived. The charming coastal town in Maine. The town where, without him, she had been reborn. He got in his car and drove down the winding roads with a pounding heart. He had rehearsed 1,000 times what he would say, but deep down, he knew that no phrase would be enough. He carried the marked book with him, his beard shaved, and a childlike anxiety in his chest. He didn't expect a reconciliation. He hoped, perhaps, for just the chance to show that he was no longer the man who had hurt her. When he arrived, he parked in front of a modest house with a white facade and blue windows, surrounded by blooming bougainvillea. It was simple, but alive. Everything about it pulsed with presence, with truth. Julian hesitated. For a second, he felt like turning back. But then, the door opened. Audrey appeared on the threshold in an apron tied at her waist and an expression of quiet astonishment. Her eyes, for a brief moment, widened, but then they narrowed slightly, as if recognizing not the man in front of her, but the history he carried. She said nothing. She just crossed her arms, waiting for him to speak. Julian couldn't find the words. No speech would make sense. He looked at her, so different, and yet so much herself. She had her hair pulled back simply, her face without makeup, but there was a new strength in the way she stood, centered. She was a complete woman, independent, serene. And yet, there was a shadow of sadness in her eyes, not from recent pain, but from nostalgia for what could have been and wasn't. "I read your book," he finally said in a hoarse voice. "Every word, and—" He paused, his voice trembling. "I didn't come to ask you to forgive me. I came to thank you for showing me who I was." Audrey listened in silence. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She had already cried everything before. The silence between them was dense, but no longer destructive. It was the silence of someone who has survived the worst and is now on neutral ground. Finally, she spoke. "Did you come for yourself or for them?" Julian frowned, confused. It was then that two children's voices resonated from inside the house. Twins, two boys. He saw them for the first time as they ran to the door, hugging their mother's legs. The world stopped. He stumbled a step backward. They were there. His children. Alive. Beautiful. Too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to change everything. Audrey knelt, stroked each boy's hair, and stood up firmly. "These are Ethan and Noah, and before you say anything, I'm going to be clear. They don't need a half-hearted father. If you want to know them, you're going to have to prove, to yourself, that you are worthy of it." Julian, his eyes teary, and his voice caught in his throat, could only nod. In that moment, he understood that there was no easy redemption. There were no shortcuts. But there, in front of her, and the children he didn't dream he had, he understood. This was his chance to start over, not with words, with actions, walking towards forgiveness. In the days following that visit, Julian didn't immediately return. He needed time to absorb the impact, not just of seeing Audrey again, but of meeting the sons he hadn't known existed for the first time. Ethan and Noah. Two names that carried weight and beauty. Two little boys who, without even knowing him, had reconfigured his entire existence. Upon returning to Chicago, he sat amidst his own ruins. The empty penthouse, the tarnished name, the lost business. For the first time, he had the clarity that none of it mattered anymore. 2 weeks later, he returned to Maine. This time, without arrogance, without a grandiose plan. Just with a simple suitcase and a plea to be heard. Audrey received him in the garden of the house, like someone receiving a visitor, not an ex-husband. The boys were with a neighbor. She didn't offer him coffee or sit in the shade with him. She stood, with her arms crossed, firm. "If you want to be a father, Julian, you have to understand one thing," she began bluntly. "This has nothing to do with me. I don't need you. The boys don't either, not yet. But they deserve the opportunity to know you. Only that opportunity can't be partial. I don't want occasional visits or nice apologies. They're going to watch you. They're going to test your presence. And it will only work if you're here, with consistency." He took a deep breath. He didn't try to negotiate. He didn't ask for time. He just replied, "I'll stay." That's how his second life change began. He left the city behind, sold what was left of the penthouse, terminated contracts, and cut ties with everything that represented his old self. He settled in a simple inn on the outskirts of the town, away from the center, near the hills. He woke up early, took long walks, and every day he wrote small reflections in an old notebook, things he was learning about himself, about silence, about loss, about love without bargaining. The first week, Audrey didn't allow him contact with the boys. She said she wanted to observe him first, and Julian understood. He started looking for small jobs in the community. He helped in a school garden, carried boxes in a library, did maintenance at the local church. No one there knew him as the businessman. Here, he was just Julian, and that both disoriented and liberated him. Audrey watched him from a distance. She saw when he wiped his face with the sleeve of his sweaty shirt, when he left food at the elderly neighbor's door, when he sat quietly on the edge of the square without his phone, just watching the world go by. There was no rush in him, no apologies, just presence. In the second week, she invited him over for a snack. Ethan and Noah were curious but wary. Audrey had prepared them, telling them who he was. With calm honesty, Julian looked at them with reverence. He didn't try to hold them. He sat on the floor beside them and listened intently when Noah showed him a drawing. Ethan didn't say much. He just watched. But at the end of the afternoon, he dropped a toy in Julian's lap. A subtle gesture, but full of meaning. That day, as he walked back to the inn, Julian smiled. Not because he was winning something back, but because he was, finally, building himself, brick by brick. And the only thing that resonated in his mind was the phrase Audrey had said when he was leaving. Love, when it's real, doesn't demand shortcuts. It demands the courage to stay. The courage to stay. Julian started from the bottom. Literally. The first job he got in town was as an assistant at a small artisanal bakery, washing pans and sweeping the floor after the last batch of bread. There was no glamour or recognition, and certainly no Italian suits. Just flour, silence, and the opportunity to be useful. At first, he felt shame. Every customer who came in, he feared being recognized, but no one saw him as the bankrupt businessman. There, he was just Julian, and little by little, that started to be enough. In parallel, he began therapy, not out of obligation, but out of necessity. He found a local psychologist recommended by a library employee. The first session was uncomfortable. He sat with his arms crossed, avoiding eye contact, trying to control his words. But with time, his defenses gave way. He cried. He laughed nervously. He confessed fears he had never dared to name. He started to understand that his whole life had been built to avoid pain, and, ironically, that's what had multiplied it. Each week, he left the sessions a little lighter. He also started writing again, as the therapist suggested. Letters he would never send. Texts that told his version of the story, not to justify, but to understand. I was absent because I thought presence was surrender, but surrender requires courage, and I never had that. He wrote on one of the pages. He kept everything in a cardboard box by the bed, like someone collecting evidence of his transformation. On Sundays, Audrey allowed him to spend a few hours with the boys. At first, the interactions were shy. Noah talked non-stop, asking difficult questions like, "Why did you leave? Are you going to disappear again? Do you know how to play, or do we need to teach you?" Julian answered calmly, swallowing his discomfort, often not knowing what to say, but never lying. And that honesty, little by little, won over the restless boy. Noah began to call him Daddy naturally, in the middle of a game or while sharing a cookie. It was spontaneous, real. Ethan was more resistant. He didn't reject him, but he didn't get close either. He watched everything with serious eyes that were too mature for his age. He would sit next to him, but never on his lap. He listened to stories, but rarely asked questions. Julian realized that with Ethan, he needed time. Trust wasn't earned with promises, but with silent presence. So he waited. He would sit next to the boy on rainy Sundays, in silence, just drawing with him or organizing the toy cars by color, as Ethan liked to do. The first moment of connection came unexpectedly. They were in the yard, and Julian noticed that Ethan always avoided touching the dirt. So, in a deliberate gesture, he dug with his hands and said, "When I was a kid, I was also afraid to get my hands dirty. My dad said it was for weak people." Ethan looked at him, attentive. "And what did you do?" "I pretended I didn't care, but I cared a lot." Ethan said nothing, but he knelt beside him and, for the first time, touched the dirt with his own fingers. It wasn't an explosion of affection. It was a small gesture. But for Julian, it was as if his son had opened a crack of trust for him. From that day on, he began to notice small changes. Ethan accepted when Julian invited him to ride his bike. He started laughing at Noah's silly jokes when they were together, and one night, he fell asleep, leaning on his shoulder. Audrey watched everything from a distance but didn't interfere. She knew that the construction of that bond was between them. She admired Julian's patience. The man who had once been so rushed for everything now learned the rhythm of his children, a rhythm that couldn't be hurried or bought, only lived. The small miracles. Saturday mornings became the three of their favorite times. They would go to the farmer's market together, where Julian would let them choose fruits, taste cheeses, and share a sweet treat at the end. Noah, with a chocolate-smeared mouth, would laugh heartily and playfully push Ethan, who would respond with timid tickles. It was simple. It was daily. But for Julian, it was sacred. There were also difficult moments. One night, Noah had a nightmare and ran to his mom's room. Seeing Julian there on the sofa, he hesitated. Audrey looked at him and, without a word, gave him a small nod. Noah then threw himself into his father's arms, crying softly. Julian hugged him tightly, feeling his heart ache. Not from his son's crying, but because in that moment he understood the weight and beauty of being a refuge. With Ethan, the final test came one afternoon when the boy, without looking directly at him, mumbled, "When you're not here, I miss you." Julian contained his emotion, swallowed his tears, and only replied, "I miss you too." Every day. Julian's transformation didn't happen in a spectacular way. It wasn't marked by a grand gesture or an epic declaration. It happened slowly, in the rhythm of real life, in the small choices, in the silent habits, in the decisions that only an attentive observer would notice. Julian learned that loving wasn't about impressing. It was about persisting. It wasn't about giving speeches. It was about being there, every day, even when he wasn't invited, even when no one noticed. He started cooking for the boys. He began with stuck rice and disastrous pancakes, but soon mastered the basics. He learned to make Noah's favorite oatmeal and the mild tomato sauce that Ethan would eat without complaining. Each meal prepared was a wordless love letter. Around the table, he began to hear laughter and confidences. He discovered that the stomach was also a path to affection. On cold mornings, it was he who took the boys to school. He woke up before the sun, packed their lunches, and checked their backpacks. The twins began to trust his presence as a constant, no longer as a visit, but as a pillar. The other parents, once curious or skeptical, started greeting him naturally. At the park, Julian was no longer the stranger. He was the dad who pushed the swing, who helped up those who fell, who laughed at their absurd stories with a smile that now came from within. With Audrey, the relationship became respectful, silent, beautiful. He didn't force conversations. He didn't try to rescue a past. He simply helped her. He washed the dishes after the boys' dinner, fixed the squeaky gate, stayed with the children when she needed to go to literary events. He never complained, never expected anything in return. He was just present. One night, when Audrey returned from a public reading, she found Julian in the living room, reading to Ethan and Noah. He used different voices for each character and laughed heartily when the boys corrected him. Audrey stood in the doorway, watching. Her heart ached, not with pain, but with a sweet nostalgia. He was there, truly there, and not for her, but for his children, for himself. Another memorable moment came when Noah fell off his bike and scraped his knee. Julian ran, picked him up, blew on the wound, and said calmly, "It's going to be okay, son. I'm here." Noah stopped crying almost immediately. It wasn't the bandage that calmed him. It was the certainty of that firm, consistent, reliable presence. Julian began writing again. Short texts about fatherhood, about new beginnings. Not for publication, at least not yet. It was a way of dialoguing with himself. He recorded his progress, his mistakes, his fears. He wrote with honesty, as he learned by observing Audrey. His words, once cold and strategic, now had warmth, had a voice, had a soul. Little by little, he began to be recognized in the town, not as the declining businessman, but as someone who had decided to truly change. The local priest invited him to help with troubled youth. The librarian called him to speak at a group for separated parents. He accepted each invitation with humility, not as a redeemer, but as someone who knew the weight of error and the value of effort. And on a typical afternoon, while walking with Ethan on one side and Noah on the other, Julian realized that they no longer asked him to come. They took his presence for granted, and that, for him, was more valuable than any forgiveness. Because being there, truly being there, was love in its most concrete form. The First Crack. Please leave your opinion on this incredible story in the comments. If you liked it, share it, and subscribe to the channel to support our work. Another story is appearing on your screen that will probably also move you. Don't miss it. Audrey was never a woman of impulsive decisions. She always observed first. She felt, she analyzed, she stayed silent before acting. That's why, over the months that Julian was transforming before her eyes, she said nothing. She just watched. Every gesture, every respectful silence, every patient step he took with the boys was a brick in the slow dismantling of the wall she had built to protect herself. But she still wondered, what if he breaks everything again? It was a legitimate fear, one of those that remains as a scar, even after healing. Audrey knew how much she had struggled to rebuild herself, alone, pregnant in the darkness, and she was afraid that any opening, however small, would put her back at the mercy of someone who had already destroyed her once before. But something inside her was beginning to give way, not because of the man Julian had been, but because of the man he was visibly striving to be now. She noticed the subtle changes, how he now listened calmly before responding, how he accepted his children's corrections without wounded pride, how he cared for their routine with responsibility and affection without expecting recognition. He wasn't seeking a reward, just presence. And that, for Audrey, was the clearest sign that something in him had, in fact, changed. On a cloudy afternoon, Audrey watched from the window as he swept dry leaves from the yard with Ethan. They both wore rain boots, concentrated, and Noah ran around with a bucket in his hand, trying to help. The scene was mundane, and because of that, so powerful. It was there, in that unheroic everyday life, where Julian was becoming real. Present, a father, and perhaps a man again. Later that same night, Audrey invited him to have dinner with them. It wasn't the first time, but there was something different in her tone. He noticed. The four of them sat at the table. She had prepared vegetable soup and artisanal bread. Julian helped serve. He told silly jokes to distract the boys, and when they were all finished, he took the plates to the sink without anyone asking him to. She said nothing, but she noticed. After putting the boys to bed, Audrey went out onto the porch with a blanket over her shoulders. Julian appeared a few minutes later, bringing 2 cups of tea. She looked at him, surprised, and he just smiled. "Chamomile. I remember you used to say it helped you sleep after a long day." They sat next to each other, the silence between them filled not with tension, but with something new, both familiar and Audrey, her eyes fixed on the sky, murmured, "You seem like a different person." "Maybe I just stopped running from the person I could be," he replied without hesitation. There was a silence after that. She didn't react with praise or resistance. She just let the phrase hang in the air, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. Julian didn't try to move forward. He didn't get any closer. He just stayed there. With her. As before, and yet, as never before. It was in that instant that Audrey realized that the anger she had carried no longer burned. Fear still existed, yes, but now it shared space with something tenuous and ineffable. Hope. Not the hope of returning to the past. She didn't want that. But of, who knows, building a different future, on new foundations. There was no grand scene, no confession in the rain, no cinematic kiss at sunset. The love between Audrey and Julian, if it was being reborn, was doing so like plants that grow in the cracks of concrete. Discreetly, almost unnoticed, but with a force that defies all odds. There were no guarantees. There was only presence. And that, for both of them, was more than enough. A second chance. Julian wasn't trying to win Audrey back. He didn't bring her flowers, make promises, or talk about reconciliation. All he did was be there. He woke up early, helped with the children, read stories, washed the dishes, and fixed what was broken. He was a constant, quietly reliable presence. And in time, Audrey began to notice that he wasn't doing it for her. He was doing it for himself, for Ethan, for Noah, for a more decent future than the past that had crushed them. Audrey, for her part, continued to guard her heart, but not with the rigidity of before. She began to allow herself to smile more. She spent more time next to Julian, talking about neutral things. The children's school, recipes, books. Sometimes, their eyes would meet for a second longer than necessary, but neither of them forced the next step. They were at peace with the slowness. Julian continued his therapy, his notebooks of reflections, and now he was writing small stories inspired by fathers and sons. He never showed them to anyone, but Audrey had found one of them, forgotten on the table. She read it in silence, and for the first time, she cried. Not from sadness, but from recognizing a man who had learned to feel. One afternoon, Noah asked directly, "Mommy, can Daddy live here with us?" Audrey, surprised, replied carefully, "Daddy has his own little house, honey, and he's always close. That's not the most important thing." Noah thought for a bit, and then said, "Yes, he's always here." That always here was what Audrey both feared and wanted most. The fear of giving in and being hurt again still existed. But now, there was also the certainty that Julian was different. Not because he wanted something in return, but because he had finally understood the value of things that couldn't be bought. Time, respect, connection. One Saturday night, after the children were asleep, Audrey invited Julian to sit on the sofa. They didn't say much. They watched an old movie in silence. At the end, he got up to leave, and she lightly touched his arm. She didn't stop him. She just touched him. A small gesture that said a lot. "You haven't come back yet, but maybe you're on your way." As she closed the door behind him, Audrey rested her forehead against the wood and took a deep breath. She was tired of being strong alone. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to be strong next to someone again. Julian, on the other side of the door, walked down the silent street with an accelerated heart. There were no promises, no ready-made happy endings. But there was something that had never existed between them before, a love that didn't run, that walked, and step by step, it was building a space where before there had only been ruin. The final words. On a morning when the sky was clear, but a light mist made the sunlight soft, almost melancholic. Julian woke up early, as he had for the past several months. But he felt something different inside him, a serene restlessness, as if he was finally ready to close a cycle that still hurt silently. It wasn't a special day, no memorable date. But for him, it was time. The time to, finally, say what he never had the courage to say. He stopped by Audrey's house in the late afternoon. She received him on the porch, with the boys playing in the yard, under the watchful eye of their grandmother, who had come to stay for a few days. Audrey wore no makeup. Her hair was loose, and she held a cup of tea. She was beautiful, not because she had dressed up, but because she seemed at peace with herself. And that, for Julian, had always been the most powerful form of beauty. "Can we talk?" he asked in a low voice. Audrey nodded and gestured for him to sit next to her on the wooden porch bench. There was a moment of silence before Julian began. He didn't have a rehearsed speech, nor did he carry letters or theatrical gestures. He carried only his vulnerability, and that was everything. "I spent my whole life running from words," he said, looking straight ahead, not at her. "I learned that feeling was a weakness, that showing pain was dangerous. So I kept quiet. I kept quiet when you told me you were tired, when I saw you cry in silence, when you wordlessly asked me to be truly there, and I didn't know how. I hid behind work, behind numbers, behind the mask of a successful man. And in the end, I lost everything that truly mattered." Audrey didn't interrupt. She just listened, her eyes fixed on him now, attentive, unhurried. "I cheated on you, yes," he continued. "But before that, I hurt you every day that I refused to see you. I denied you not with words, but with absence. And today I understand that was worse than any physical mistake, because it was continuous, because it killed something inside you. And for a long time, I hated myself for that. I thought I would never be able to fix it, but now I don't want to fix anything. I just want to give you back the truth you always deserved." He then turned and faced her. "I loved you, in my wrong, clumsy, fearful way, but I loved you. And it's only now that I understand how much true love requires courage. Thank you for not letting me destroy you. Thank you for protecting our children from the worst of me. And," he took a deep breath, "forgive me, not for me, but for you, so you don't have to carry this anymore." Audrey's eyes were teary. She hadn't cried in a long time, but those words, the ones he had never said before, the ones she had waited so long for and then given up on hearing, had a liberating weight. Not because they promised a return, but because they closed a cycle, a period of mourning, a history. "I don't know what's going to happen between us," he said finally, "and I didn't come here expecting anything. I just needed, after all this time, to give you the words I never said, because you deserve every one of them, and because I can only move on if I don't leave anything unfinished." Audrey took a deep breath. She closed her eyes for an instant, and then replied in a serene voice, "Thank you for saying them now. Even if it's late, they still have value." Then she looked at him, with tenderness, with memory, with something close to acceptance. "Maybe we won't be what we were, but maybe, just maybe, we can discover who we can be now, without rush, without ties." Julian smiled for the first time without guilt, a clean smile. And there, Under the lavender sky of that town that had been the setting for so many new beginnings, two people who had once been lost finally found each other. Not as a couple, but as two whole human beings. Ready, at last, to begin again. I invite you to leave your opinion on this incredible story in the comments. If you liked it, share it, and subscribe to the channel to support our work. Another story is appearing on your screen that will probably also move you. Don't miss it.